You're live. You're live.
We are live? Okay, thank you very much, Mohsin. Thank you all for tuning into our half hour today. You will obviously see myself, Gilbert, in front of the camera, but my colleague Roger is also present in our chat today to answer any of the questions that may come up during the presentation. So feel free, please, to jump right into a discussion there if you want to. We decided to take a more, let's say, light approach to the topic of counterfeiting or brand protection. So our presentation today will, well, for some of you maybe feel like a trip down memory lane. For others, I hope it is an interesting summary of the security technologies and trends we have seen in the past decades. About halfway, I would say, I would try to compact all of the findings into a conclusion of the status quo and use that knowledge actually to introduce mozaiq's contribution to product authentication. Okay. In a global era like ours today, it is not very surprising to see a very strong focus on online brand protection. I've heard this morning also already a blockchain against counterfeiting, tracking, tracing, serialization, and so on and so forth. And in no means I intend to argue with the usefulness of this field of expertise. But if I take a step back, then the common denominator there actually is activity. The majority of these technologies, well, if not all, seek to somehow protect reputation and credibility by monitoring and exterminating fraudulent activities, whether this is now online or offline. But by no means those technologies as such are factually authenticating a product. Authentication in its purest sense can only take place on the product itself, or second best by means of an authenticator which is physically anchored on the product. So even in highly digitized societies like ours, you still need, and most likely always will need, tangible real-world proof of the originality of the product. And that will be the focus of this presentation today, these physical anchors. So for the sake of argument, I will use the word label in the presentation today, but feel free to replace that with package, tag, bag, wrapper, whichever suits your specific situation. In its simplest form, and from a high flight altitude, a label basically consists of three functionalities. It holds a substrate, typically used for carrying some form of graphics, whether or not this is secured. And more recently, we can add the connectivity or interactivity as a third functionality. Again, we're talking about a very coarse granularity. My intention today is to take you through all of these layers, but then through the lens of security, look a bit at the past and how do we see this kind of security these days. Let's call it a little bit of entertainment before we dive into the more serious half, where I will reveal mozaiq's contribution to the topic. Okay, let's get started with the top layer, the interactive layer. This is a layer which is specifically designed for us to interrogate the subject we are interested in. And interaction, in my view, ranges from simple printed solutions like barcoding or serial numbers to the high-tech solutions like RFID and NFC. So in one way or another, these features are integrated into or onto the label to make our life easier, and in many cases these days are designed to engage with the consumer or the user of the product. However, let's please also agree on another thing. They shall not be used for authentication. In fact, in today's world, I believe they are most likely the features which actually have the biggest security threat. Anything digital can be hacked, and tracking barcodes is meaningless. What do I mean with that? For example, if you look at a poster like this one, you may find an NFC tag embedded in there that may direct you to a website for some shopping. It's now not very hard to imagine that a hacker can reprogram this tag for his own purpose. He can break the tag's encryption, load some malicious software or some malicious code into the memory, and then suddenly your phone starts to send your personal information somewhere unintended. Again, anything digital can be hacked. All that will take is a savvy geek with some criminal streak and enough time on his hands. Then, for my second bold statement, tracking barcodes is meaningless. The greatest threat with the widely known QR codes, in fact, comes from the very nature of its design. It was created to be machine readable, not for human visual interpretation. So in other words, the vulnerability comes from within the open nature of the platform itself. It means anyone can easily replicate any kind of QR code, incorporate any kind of information they want. And then you place a fake code on a fake product, and it becomes nearly indistinguishable from an original code on an original product. And of course, I can hear some of you say you can use closed systems. Like the codes can only be read by a special app. I'll come back to that subject later on, but for now, I will leave you with the question, like, how big of a fan are you personally when it comes to downloading yet another app for one specific purpose on your smartphone, right? I think we can all agree that generally the native phone app on your smartphone that captures a QR code straight from your camera is like far more easier than any of the other complicated stuff. I mean, don't get me wrong. I am like a big fan of machine automated processes that make our lives every day so much more convenient and simple. And I also believe that in direct channels with a high level of trust between the partners, these technologies can be very valuable in optimizing many processes. However, given the choice between security and convenience, people will complain about security, but they will opt for convenience. And as we'll see also in the rest of the presentation, it's exactly this kind of convenience that bothers us actually quite often. So let's turn to the graphic layer. The graphic layer is in many sites a very interesting layer. It carries many different aspects. It can convey a promotional message or some warning information or give instructions for use, right down to unique numbering for identification. I think no other layer actually sees such huge diversity in applications or has a higher interest in innovations as the graphical layer does. And of course, this is because that layer is most prominently present and catches our immediate attention. So in the light of anti-counterfeiting, it is not very strange to see that the early attempts were largely aimed to protect trademark infringements. So all is far easier to duplicate the package and try to pass it off as a known brand than to replicate the actual product itself. So what you would see in the brand protection world is that in order to stay one step ahead, legitimate brand owners would frequently change the design of their package, and with time, bespoke features began to appear on the package, such as the microtexting, patterning, color shifting inks, and many others. The appeal of these technologies is the ease with which consumers can actually verify the product. It simply means the feature has to be present on the package and recognized by the consumer. So for that reason, this group is referred to as the passive technology. You don't really have to do anything. You just check for its presence in one way or another. And I would say that probably the most exciting entrant quite recently is the hologram. The hologram was invented in the 1940s already by a British-Hungarian engineer named Denis Gabor. I don't think you can get more British-Hungarian than Denis Gabor, but that's a completely different sidetrack. The commercial use as any counterfeiting tool was only introduced in the 1980s by whiskey maker Johnny Walker. And then what you would see is within a few years, holograms started to play an increasingly important role, not just as an anti-counterfeiting feature, but more and more also for branding purposes, down to the point where it actually has been so diluted that in many cases it's barely recognized as a security feature anymore. However, the biggest drawback, I would say, in my opinion, of passive technologies is they, in one way or another, play to the counterfeiter's favor. Once you copy them, you can mass apply them. A few words about layering as an attempt to make counterfeiters' life more difficult. In layering, people have begun to combine initiatives, but a fundamental problem here is that quite often layering is misunderstood. And what people do is they start to combine more and more passive features into one solution. In my view, that doesn't make the security barrier itself higher. It only makes the time required to crack it down longer. After that, you're back to ground zero. You can go back to mass application of the counterfeited or fake labels. There is, however, also a second problem which receives far less attention, but actually represents a real dilemma, and that's called the mere exposure effect or the familiarity effect. And the familiarity effect is a fundamental principle in the field of sensory psychology, which tells you that repeated exposure to stimulus creates a certain relation in your brains where it is stored for easy access later. Now, in evolution, this is what makes us easily recognize something we have encountered in the past, and therefore we don't have to spend a lot of time to process that signal. You know, that's convenient because since we are familiar with it, our brain immediately knows what action is required. I think that's exactly what is bothering us in counterfeiting, right? Because counterfeiters are creating near perfect, well, sometimes even clearly flawed replicas. But thanks to this familiarity effect, thanks to our familiarity with the passive features, we won't spend a lot of time trying to judge them meticulously. And that even goes for professional inspectors whom you expect to be diligent, but even they are not fully immune to this. So by now, I hope all of you have noticed that this logo on the right-hand side will look very familiar to you, as it is a mix of the Adidas and the Puma logo. So back to our struggle to combine somehow security with mass empowerment. In the 90s, we see a new generation of technologies to begin appearing, and they were driven by the emerging need for solutions that were resistant to counterfeiting. They are the so-called closed-loop systems, as I've mentioned before, or the active technologies. Obviously, they're called active because they require the user to actively interrogate a feature, for example, a taggant with a special reading device. Active securities offer unsurpassed security due to the sophistication of the taggant and the closed loop with the associated reader. However, that security actually comes at a price. We had to abandon mass empowerment of consumers because consumers simply do not possess the specialized proprietary readers that are usually a bare necessity to figure out where the active taggants usually are, because they are undetectable for the human eye. Therefore, active technologies usually are aimed at surveillance activities done by security personnel or other trained experts. So in an attempt to bring the consumer back into the game in the, let's say, the past decade, we've seen a dramatic rise in track and trace programs. Just this morning, I listened to the tobacco presentation from PMI. There's the pharmaceutical industry, all of which now require industry-wide, universal, unique serial numbers to be placed on each individual product. And typically, these initiatives are driven by governments. First of all, because governments can actually carry forward a broad public opinion, for example, the health damage. And second of all, governments actually have the executional power to penetrate deeply into all facets of the supply chain. I would say, however, that customer-based authentication regimes in the consumer product sector are on the rise, but really effective large-scale integration as a security feature, well, I guess unfortunately still is a wet dream to many. The applied unique digital serial number or barcode usually only allows for physical validation against time and location of the specific code or product, but it does not necessarily authenticate this unique serial number. And that brings me actually to the status quo of today, where we see that brands and solutions providers have begun to combine the functionalities across the different layers. So combining the digital connectivity with tracking solutions that is for exclusive protection by the selected trusted expert. So the basic idea is to protect your consumer barcode with another technology. So you place a unique number on the label, use that, right, to track the product and provide all kinds of public information. But at the same time, there is a second functionality of the label, a hidden layer, which then authenticates the barcode, the label, and therewith the product. For me, it is absolutely mandatory that the technology used in that second layer is hidden, and its only purpose is to provide irrefutable evidence as to whether the label and the public code are genuine or not. It has to be actually interrogated, not just looked at by the inspector or your trained expert. Okay, so in conclusion, a brand protection strategy nowadays is one that makes a clear, distinct choice about the intention of incorporating a certain feature. So for consumer engagement, you use mass empowerment tools to monitor activity. For factual authentication, you be prepared to install, equip, and train a dedicated task force on how to read the additional hidden features. Now, I have promised for the second half of my presentation to tell you more about mozaiq's approach. So far, we have left the substrate untouched. And actually, I think all of you will recognize the benefit of a tamper-evident label. It prohibits the counterfeiter from simply peeling off a genuine label and then have it copied onto a counterfeit product. And usually these labels will crumble to pieces or leave some kind of a mark that says void or opened or something like it. In some cases, we actually find passive features like fibers or threads in the carrier substrate. And in all honesty, I must admit that in general, passive solutions in the mass of the substrate yield a slightly better protection than those in print. But that is actually purely based on the type of machinery which is required to produce a substrate. If you think of the size and complexity of a paper machine compared to a printer, then you understand, of course, that the features that are incorporated in a base layer are far more difficult to replicate than anything which is printed, even if this probably won't stop a professional counterfeiter. Okay, but what if we can take that protection of the substrate to a different level? What if we can actively involve the substrate in the security of the label? Mozaiq has developed an active technology as part of the substrate, and we call this chemical print. In a nutshell, chemical print is the targeted modification of the surface structure of the substrate materials, so the blank carrier, even before the printing line sees it. So our technology initiates a chemical reaction on the substrate that changes both the morphology as well as its topography. Ironically, our technology is actually applied with a printing technique, high-speed inkjet roll-to-roll. We have the demo line that you can see here available for testing in our lab in Switzerland. But that really is the only analogy we have with graphic solutions. Our ink is a reactive fluid, a chemical fluid that interacts with the substrate, creates a pattern which is chemically bound and incorporated in the label carrier to give it its own unique identifier. And the patterns we can make can take many different shapes. You can have logos, pictures, geometrical patterns, text, or eventually human readable codes. And it's obviously this last option that allows us to actively involve the substrate in the security system. We have an overprintable, non-copy protection that turns any plain label into a bespoke security label, which can be actively interrogated via its permanent identifier. And that means that, like this particular label with this particular substrate ID carries these particular graphics for that particular product. So as advocated before, there is a clear separation of purpose. We have, on the one hand, a crisp and clean graphical layer for branding purposes or mass empowerment for that matter. And then there is an additional hidden layer with an identifier that will serves both to protect the substrate as well as the graphical branding image. And as bonus, this new type of security is not yet known to counterfeiters. And according to the earlier findings, it is only accessible with the additional hardware, which is then available to only to your company's trusted experts. Let me make a few words on that hardware that we are also having. We're also making a clear, distinct choice in our hardware. Reading back signals quite often is, again, a matter of choosing between convenience and security. And a lot of devices have chosen the convenient route. For example, in UV, UV features typically use a restricted incoming wavelength of light, right? That makes my life as a counterfeiter relatively easy, because I only have to use my blue pen, which I can buy for 10 euros, with a 365, 385 nanometer wavelength to figure out which response green, blue, red, yellow my fake label has to imitate. On the other end of the spectrum, there are infrared features, and they work exactly the other way around. So there you typically control the observation bandwidth. And well, it almost becomes even easier there because infrared absorption is binary. I either apply an absorbing material, then the feature appears black, or it's translucent and it disappears. So in either way, neither in UV or in infrared, there is a confirmation of the material that was used to create the signal. So in our device, we have added the necessary hardware that allows us to control, like in true forensic interrogations, the incoming as well as the observation signal, which leaves virtually no other room for the counterfeiter than to manipulate the label in exactly the same chemical way as we would normally do. Now, I mentioned quickly forensic operations. The noticeable difference with the regular forensic operations is that those forensic examinations are usually limited to expensive, non-mobile lab environments. And what we have created is an exclusive mobile security platform that we have, and this is our only trade-off to convenience. We have, for convenience reasons, fully integrated that onto a smartphone that operates on an Android OS. So basically, your field officer can use his device like any other consumer will do, right? So he can read his mails. He can obviously look at the public codes which are on the products, get that kind of information. He can browse the internet, use social media, even if you don't want them to. But in addition, we have integrated some extra hardware which allows him or her with the right credentials to open up a completely different world and dig deeper into the hidden layer and truly authenticates the product or the label that he's looking at. So you can pull up some sort of tracing facts or any kind of other information you may not want to display to the public, and you don't want to get hacked either. So coming to a conclusion, mozaiq's contribution to today's brand protection systems is a new kind of closed loop system with a very high security and a high convenience level to the experts that are using it. We are on a mission to add individuality to the substrate as an alternative way to secure products or supply chains, and have that as a new line of defense against counterfeiters. We were established in 2016 as a dedicated branch of a large Swiss multinational corporation, but with the specific intention to market security solutions to brand owners and governments. For today, I hope you have enjoyed this presentation. We would be very interested to see if substrate protection is something that could work for your specific case. So please feel free to reach out to either Roger or myself, either during or after this conference, for a more in-depth discussion or a demonstration. Thank you very much for your attention today. I wish you all a great conference, and we will be available in the chat for any questions you may have. And I guess it's back to you now, Moshe.
Thank you so much, Gilbert, for such a tremendous presentation. Thank you so much for being the part of 8th Annual Global Brand Protection Innovation Program. It was an honor for us that you have shared with us such a great insights of the conference. And definitely people will show very curiosity to contact with you directly to ask, because this is such a phenomenal aspect and insight that you have shared with us, that it will definitely add value to all the people who are attending this conference. So thank you so much. And now you can go on the main stage. People, you can ask any question from Gilbert. He and his team will be available on the main stage and they will be answering your question. Thank you so much. And now we will be going to our next presentation. Thank you so much, Gilbert. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So now we will be coming to our next panel discussion. So just wait a few minutes and we'll be coming back. Thank you.